Today's sponsor is Datadog, a real-time monitoring platform that unifies metrics, logs, and distributed traces from your cloud containers and orchestration software. Datadog's container-centric monitoring features allow you to track the health and performance of your dynamic container environment. The Container Map provides a bird's-eye view of your container fleet, and the Live Container View searches, groups, and filters your containers with any criteria, like tags, pods, or workspaces. To start monitoring your container clusters, sign up for a free trial today, and Datadog will send you a free t-shirt. Visit datadog.com/container-cloudcast to get started. That's datadog.com/container-cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. November of 2022 is upon us. It's last 2 months of the year, and Aaron, I think for the first time in many, many, many years, we are both doing not only Cloud News of the Week, but we're also doing the interview thing. So let's have at it, man.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll make this as quick as possible because we try and keep Cloud News super short. But got a couple interesting articles this week and interesting trends that are developing here in the public cloud space that's definitely worth talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're sort of related. I think really they both sort of boil down to the same concept, which is the three main cloud providers. So, like we like to say, it's cloud earnings season. So the three main cloud providers all came out with their numbers. And, I think for the last 5-6 years, as long as I can remember now, because my memory only goes back so far, the numbers have always been, they're going up, and they beat their numbers from, they beat expectations, and they beat last year's year over year. And I think for the very first time, other than maybe Google Cloud, they all continue to grow. They all continue to, Amazon grew $82 billion run rate, growing at 28% year over year. Microsoft Azure, $50 billion run rate, estimated again, as we've always said, they're not as transparent, growing 42% year over year, although they were at 46% last year or last quarter. And then Google Cloud, 27% run rate, up 38%. Last quarter, they were at 36%. So really the first time the big two have, I guess, in a sense, sort of missed their number, which is sort of a big deal, I think, in terms of, we've talked about the economy, but what's your initial thoughts at seeing some of these numbers?
Yeah, so two initial thoughts. Number one, it was really interesting to see the growth slowing. And that's something we've seen. As the numbers get bigger, the numbers get harder. And also with the economy and everything else going on. So, but the fact is 28% year over year and 42% year over year is now disappointing.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that was interesting is this is the first time that Microsoft is now more than 50%, like just barely, more revenue comes from the cloud than comes from software, which is pretty amazing feat given it's probably been 15 years since they first started offering like Office in the cloud and stuff like that.
Yeah. And if you really think about it, the number of companies that have done a turnaround or a pivot or have gone into a, new industry, if you will, and generated that revenue and done it successfully and stayed on top. I mean, it's a handful of companies in history.
Yeah.
And the fact that they were able to do this is just absolutely amazing. And AWS, of course, is the machine and continues to chug along. But it also relates to our second article in there, which is, even though they're all growing and we're seeing maybe a slight bit of a pullback, the entire infrastructure market as a whole is down 24%.
Yeah. So, I think what we're probably going to end up seeing is a little bit of slowdown. I shouldn't say a slowdown. I think what we're seeing is the low-hanging fruit has been picked for the cloud. Essentially, the combination of sort of the fruit's been picked for the last 10 plus years. Plus, we've got a little bit of economic slowdown, which might cause some people to say, well, I don't know if I need to take on that next project in the cloud. Maybe what I have in my data center is just fine. I think we're beginning to see that. And what we're going to probably see is getting stuff to the cloud, and we've said this for a while, is going to start getting harder in terms of lift and shifting things, right? Not so much new stuff, but moving stuff into the cloud is going to get harder. And we'll see, certain sort of associated slowdowns in terms of numbers probably accordingly.
Yep. And on top of all of that, last bit, before we go into the break is related to cost. And this is something we're definitely going to talk about on the KubeCon side of the show. Because cost, I mean, as things start to slow down, cost becomes a bigger and bigger deal, and sensitivity to costs. And we're just seeing that trend continue.
Yeah, there's one more article I'll put in the Cloud News of the Week now that I think about it. Our friends at Clouded Judgment, who at some point we should have on the show, we've recommended their Substack articles and subscription a whole bunch of times. It's free. They do a really good job this last week, and we'll put it in the show notes or in the Cloud News of the Week, talking about some of the things that even Amazon talked about in their quarterly earnings, which was, because some people are slowing down their spend a little bit, Amazon's starting to, they're calling it optimizing, but it's really, kind of doing some interesting things like cutting back the costs on the rates that they charge people to send data out of the cloud, which had always been extremely high. They're pushing some people away from like spot instances, which are sort of higher cost, higher margin, to things that are a little more longer term. So it's going to be the other thing that'll be interesting to watch over the next, say, 4 to 6 quarters is how that impacts the margins in the cloud. Because, especially in the case of AWS, AWS drives the boat now for Amazon. It drives most of its profit margin, and it'll be, that'll be interesting to be a yin and yang as to how Amazon can invest and all those sort of things. So, but that is a show for much bigger analysis, and we'll definitely have to dig into that in a further show. Maybe we'll do that one maybe right after reInvent or something, kind of get some vibe from there. So let's wrap up Cloud News of the Week. You and I are going to talk about KubeCon because both of us were in the Motor City last week, and we're going to dive into things we saw at KubeCon right after the break. Today's show is sponsored by CloudZero. For software-driven companies focused on growing margins, CloudZero is the only cloud cost intelligence platform that puts engineering in control by connecting technical decisions to business results. By analyzing cloud services like AWS and Snowflake, CloudZero provides real-time cost insights that help you maximize margins. Engineering teams can answer critical questions like, who are my most expensive customers? How much does this specific feature cost our business? What's the cost impact of re-architecting this application? With cost anomaly alerts via Slack, product-specific data views, and granular engineering context that makes it easy to investigate any cost, CloudZero is your complete cloud cost intelligence platform, connecting the dots between high-level trends and individual line items. Join companies like Drift, Rapid7, and SeatGeek by visiting cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started today. That's cloudzero.com/cloudcast. Buffering. How annoying. Did you know that 17 out of 20 people stop watching a video because of stalling and rebuffering? Don't let your users click away to a competitor's site. If your business lies on online media, rely on CDN77 to deliver a seamless online experience to your audience. CDN77 is one of the leading global providers of content delivery network services. They power the world's most popular websites and apps, such as Udemy, ESL Gaming, live sports TV, and social media platforms. Aside from their massive and redundant global network, you're going to love their no BS attitude and skilled team of engineers ready to help 24/7. No chatbots, no tickets bouncing around unresolved for days, just people who know your use case and can immediately help you pinpoint and fix the problems. Don't wait until your users run out of patience. Go to cdn77.com/cloudcast and ask for a free trial with no duration or traffic limits. That's cdn77.com/cloudcast. And we're back. And Aaron, as we talked about at the top of the show, we're both on this one. This is honestly, for people that haven't listened to the show for a long time, you and I both used to be on all the shows all the time, both segments. So this is really the first time in a long time.
I never thought of it that way, but it's true.
It's sort of the reunion tour
Yes.
where we were actually, I think for the first time in literally 3 years, you and I were at live events together, and this time it was KubeCon. So let's jump right into it. I will point this out. Our good friends over at Software Defined Talk, who we've had on before, or at least Brandon we've had on before. I know you got to meet Matt Ray. I tried to go over it. I tried to go over it. I know. I tried to go over and meet him. He wasn't at the booth. But they just put out another perspective on Matt was at KubeCon as well. So it's always good to get multiple points of view. We'd recommend you go listen to their show. We recommend it anyways. But Aaron, let's just start right at the beginning. What did you think was good? What did you think was bad about CloudNativeCon/KubeCon?
So a couple different things. First of all, I'm going to come at it. it was really interesting. And what I mean by that is how much of this is, hey, things are returning, or how much of this is like, hey, post-COVID trends of this is the way shows are going forward. I mean, we could do almost a whole show just on that. But 7,000-ish attendees. I never heard an official number, but 300 vendor companies. And that means 300 booths on the show floor. And so if you just do the math for a second, I mean, it was a VMworld, Cisco Live, small AWS reInvent size show floor for 7,000 people when it would normally be 20, 25,000 people. So, and there's pros and cons to that. Plenty of room to spread out, not having to worry about it, especially in a post-COVID world. So that was really interesting, and that's something we can talk about separately. I thought it was well organized. I did, overall, considering the size of the show and both the growth it experienced in the last few years, and I admit, so my own company, day job, like we were rusty. Like it's like, how do you run a show again, and how do you do this again?
Yeah.
The fact that it was run as well as it was, I thought was a testament to CNCF.
Yeah, no, the CNCF does a great job. They do enough events that they're not rusty. They did a really good job. People have their opinions on if it should be a masked event or not. It was their call. It was a masked event. It was easy to get in and out, show verification, all that sort of stuff. The CNCF, amongst all the other things, you can have criticism of them for various things, but like they run events very well, and they do a really good job of being accommodating to the fact that it's a diverse audience. I mean, it's people that come from all different places, so they try and adapt to food. People have whether it's disability or whatever challenge they might have, they do a really good job with that. They still do a lot of stuff around scholarships to help people that might struggle financially to be able to get there to come to the show. So they, amongst all the things that they do a really awesome job of saying we are open to anybody. We will try and accommodate as best we can all the things that you might need in order for the show to be enjoyable for you, to be helpful for you. And for that, they've really done a very good job in this, super open event, at being able to run a good show.
Yep. Agreed. Now we've said some praise, but there's definitely some things I think could improve on.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And Detroit. So, I don't want to knock Detroit too bad, but it was okay. It's my first time in Detroit in probably 20 years. It was good. It was fine. We can get into a whole topic of, choosing cities for tech conferences and venues and hotels and all those other things. But I mean, it was okay.
Yeah.
The keynotes. So I'll say this is all secondhand for me because I did not get a chance because I was doing the day job. I didn't get a chance to see the keynotes, but I heard not awesome things.
Yeah.
I don't know if you were able to attend them.
Yeah, I watched a little bit of them on video. So the problem with the keynote at KubeCon is we try and compare it to we try and compare it to reInvent, right? Like that's become sort of the gold standard. And the thing with reInvent is centered around what Amazon does. And of course, the CNCF is centered around nothing anymore. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but like they're basically like, we're going to tell you about all of our projects, and they do it in various ways. And sometimes they let the project lead go up there for 2 minutes. Sometimes they let a vendor do it. Obviously they sell some platinum keynote sessions to various folks. So it's a very disjointed sort of thing. And again, a lot of this goes to the CNCF has taken on so many projects. I mean, I think I saw it's 34, I don't know, graduated or sort of second level projects and 80 something like sandbox projects. The biggest thing with the CNCF is they went from when Dan Kahn ran it, rest in peace to Dan. Obviously it was very, very early days, but it seemed like they were very much trying to become, a group that sort of defined a stack, right? So it was like, we're going to define Kubernetes, and we're going to define, a monitoring stack, and we're going to define a couple of things. And so there wasn't a lot of projects. There was a pretty rigorous thing to get in. And sort of towards the end of Dan's tenure and now Priyanka's tenure, I think the CNCF as a whole has taken very much a thing that says, well, there's a lot of money to be made in taking on these projects. Yes, we're pretty good at shepherding them, but it makes their events so incredibly hard to follow in terms of like, there is no center to them anymore. It used to be Kubernetes, but it's not anymore. So yeah, the keynote
fragmented from a telling a story standpoint, or trying to do something you'd typically see at a show. I mean, it's just completely fragmented.
Yeah. So I think my knock on the keynotes is just like, I don't know what I'm supposed to get out of it. Right. I don't. Yeah. Going in, it's an hour of time that I'm like, I don't know what I'm getting out of this other than there's a lot of projects.
Fair. What'd you think about the day one, day two kind of stuff? And by the way, to clarify, so there was the Monday and Tuesday was almost like separate events, if you will, or separate days, and then the main conference, if you will, was Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. To clarify.
Yeah, and the thing with the day one and day two things is, and just to put a little bit of historical context on this, because I know it really intimately. At the not the very first, the second KubeCon, the one that was in Seattle, Diane Mueller, who I used to work with at Red Hat, we've had on the show a number of times. She's fantastic. She basically said, hey, there's going to be this KubeCon thing. And she had a community that was around some stuff that was Red Hat specific, OpenShift specific. She said, I'd love to do sort of a community, breakout thing for this little group. And so she did a thing the day before. I think we got 100 people that attended that very first time, or 75, or I forget what the number was. And essentially we did it for free. Like, we didn't charge anything to do it. It was just, you had to come in a day early and you were going to get a chance to talk about kind of specific things, not kind of the breadth of KubeCon. And so she was really successful doing that for a couple of years. I think a lot of other people kind of picked up on this idea of like, oh, it's harder and harder to get any real megaphone or any real kind of noise at a noisy event like KubeCon. And so people started doing these one-day events the day before. And sometimes they would charge a little bit to cover their cost. Other times they charged quite a bit. Maybe they're trying to make money out of it. And now it's sort of spun into there's 2 days of those things before. And I think there was some pushback. I think there was some legitimate pushback on them. We talked to Rob Hirschfeld, who I had some really good conversations with. We're going to have him back on the show. And his argument was like, look, it's fine if somebody wants to charge, or the CNCF wants to charge like $300 or $400 as like an extra thing, but it restricts you to only like that vendor's thing or that group's thing. His thing was like, hey, if you want to charge me $400, charge me for the day and let me go in between them. That would be a much more, useful thing, because maybe you don't want to be for the whole session. I thought that was very valid criticism. There was, and I'll let it remain nameless. Somebody can go find the tweets. There was somebody who has literally made tens of millions of dollars off the Kubernetes community, who said, oh, it's a terrible thing that I had to spend $300 or $400, or I wouldn't spend my $300 or $400 to go do this thing. And the CNCF has become this, money hungry thing. And it was sort of like, look, dude who's made literally tens of millions of dollars, just keep that to yourself. It's a bad look. Don't do that. I'll let folks go find out who it is, but it's definitely a bad look. But the thing about it is the events are great. If you do end up going to one of the events, they really are good, because they're like a little mini thing that group typically puts on, and they all know that it's a techie thing. So they really aren't marketing driven. They just happen to be some vendor or some group or some project that goes, I want more airtime to talk about my stuff. So, hey, one last thing about the cities. And I think there is a legitimate gripe to be made about what the CNCF's been doing lately. And this goes all the way back, in my opinion, to Los Angeles. And I understand what the CNCF has always been relatively good about saying, we're going to go to places that, aren't Orlando and Las Vegas, or Orlando, Las Vegas, San Francisco. They sort of say, hey, look, we're a group. We come from a lot of different places. They were always I'm just going to say this, they're much better at picking cities before. Los Angeles is a terrible place to do conventions. It's not convenient for travel. It's really expensive. And then, instead of doing Barcelona, they did it 3 hours in a different, place in Valencia this last time. They did it in Detroit. Detroit in late October, not a desirable place. People don't want to go there. Next year, it's in Chicago, even later in November. It's going to be cold. It's not desirable. And then next time in Europe, it's going to be in Amsterdam, which on the surface sounds really cool, but it's during 420 week. And so it's going to be the most expensive week you could possibly be in Amsterdam. So I appreciate whoever's doing it. They're probably getting a bunch of cool trips out of it, but it is a real pain in the butt when getting to these places, walking around these places, the weather is bad. Like, you're not going to get the show you want out of it, right? It's just, it doesn't work out. Like, Austin was awesome when we could go over to 6th Street and you could do stuff. Right now they're picking bad venues, in my opinion.
Yeah, agreed. Well, and peel back the curtain for just a second. How many times did I rant with you over text about Detroit, and even, this is months ago, and all the hotel rooms were out, and it was just a complete shit show. Don't pick something on the border of another country where half the hotel rooms are in another country.
Yeah. Look, here's the thing. I know people hate going to like Las Vegas or whatever, but like, they do events really, really well, and it's just, I don't know. There's something about that is appealing. And I know people are like, oh, I want to find some really cool, weird restaurant and whatever. Like, sometimes there's trade-offs, and it just, right now it feels like they're a little skewed in the wrong direction.
Agreed. Hey, and we're going to be talking about technology and all that in here, but I have one more thing I want to bring up as well.
Yep.
So when I mentioned earlier about the attendees and the number of vendors and companies, is this Big Tent 2.0? And what I mean by that is OpenStack and the Big Tent days, and it was kind of the downhill trend after that. And what I mean by that is because I think it was OpenStack Paris was the running joke was there was more vendors than customers at the event. Yeah. Now I will say this, in KubeCon's defense, there was a decent amount of customers, and so I don't think so yet. But I am also concerned at the number of sponsors versus the number of attendees, and all of the people all of those vendors brought. It's something I'm definitely carefully watching. And to your point earlier too, the CNCF has definitely figured out how to monetize this. If you want to give the CNCF money, they'll take it.
Yeah. I'm gonna hold my thoughts on that. I'm gonna do a whole Sunday perspective on that one, about what kind of like, how do we compare this show? Is it Big Stack 2.0? Is it VMworld 2.0? Is it AWS reInvent for open source? Like, I think there's some pretty interesting analogies to look at. I will say this, and for those who don't know what we're talking about OpenStack, I'll put a link in the show note. I did a really, really long Sunday perspectives like a year and a half ago about what happened with OpenStack. But I think at the end of the day, there are a lot of functioning, God, that sounds like drug dealer. There are a lot of in production Kubernetes environments that are at KubeCon, infinitely more so than was ever at OpenStack. So I don't think that should be the worry. Your point about lots of vendors, we can talk about that as a separate concern, because I think that is an area to be concerned about.
Kubernetes first hit is free.
So let's talk about the technology stuff. So I mentioned this to a few people. To me, I'll frame it two ways. So you and I haven't been to KubeCon I haven't been there in 3 years. I used to go religiously because I obviously was doing a lot more Kubernetes than you were. Yeah. Haven't been.
The last time I was Seattle, by the way.
Yeah. So
2018 maybe.
Yeah. I went to all of them other than the COVID ones. To me, there was two things. Number one, Kubernetes is no longer the center of this show. It always was, right? Hence the reason why it's called KubeCon, even though the CNCF wants to call it CloudNativeCon, right? It has this sort of weird double name. It always used to be Kubernetes, and then there was some other stuff. Now Kubernetes is it's like woven into the fabric of the carpet, but it's really not talked about anymore. It's just sort of assumed that everybody's there because you do Kubernetes. And I think on one hand, that's a really good thing. It means the project is really stable. I mean, it's Kubernetes 1.25. They've done 25 releases. They release it less times per year. So that's all good. The flip side of that, and this isn't a negative, it's just the reality where we are today. What that means is there's now, 12 ancillary, I don't know if it's 12, maybe it's 10, 15, whatever. Everything is like sort of a focus, right? So it could be service mesh, it could be CI/CD, it could be cloud native backup, it could be cost management, it could be secure supply chain, but it doesn't have a focus anymore. It has like all these little kind of blips on the radar And so what's going to be interesting, I sort of frame this up as like Kubernetes was cloud native 1.0. This is now this sort of cloud native 2.0 era. And it's going to be interesting to see how it evolves. Like, can you run a show where you don't have one central focus point, but you have a whole plethora of interesting technologies, but you don't have one central focus point. That to me, like, was a huge technology shift this time.
Yeah. And I mean, if you step back for 1 second, the closest analogy we have to that is like an AWS reInvent when it got, super huge of like, hey, here's Alexa stuff, and here is the AWS web stuff, and here's, everything and anything under the sun all under one roof. And what they ended up doing was like, well, if you want to do that, well, that's in that casino over there. And if you want to do that, that's in that casino over there. And so you definitely saw a fragmentation happen over time. And that's just naturally, it just became too big to be, one central place anymore. It just got too confusing. Now, to your point, though, I will say this. So I spent most of my time on the show floor with the day job. I did walk, all 200 or 300 booths, one end to the other. Definitely a couple things popped out at me. There's a ton of companies in the cost management space. There's a ton of company that have security in their booth tagline in one way or another. WASM and WebAssembly definitely seem to be the cool kid at the party.
Yep.
And so it was really interesting to me to see the trends even, here pop up this year of like, okay, who's getting traffic? Where is there a bunch of players in a space? And it was kind of all over the place, like to kind of find the booths, on the show floor. I mean, it was a lot of people, I think, doing tactical of like, okay, there's a lot of booths here. I'm going to go talk to these 5 companies that I know about. And so there was a lot less browsing booth to booth.
Yeah, it was. It did have a little bit of like when you go to Home Depot and you kind of go in thinking you need to do certain things, and then you're like, oh yeah, I could fix something in the bathroom, and oh, by the way, I could use that tool, and like, but you wander around because you're like, I'm not really sure where certain stuff is, and it's really big, and I I need a map, and it was interesting. The one other little nuance with WebAssembly that I think is interesting, and we talked to I know we've talked to Fermion. I'm trying to think if we've talked to some of the other companies that just announced recently. They were clear when they came out and they said like, hey, we're going to run these WebAssembly like PaaS platforms. And they said under the covers is not Kubernetes. So it'll be interesting because Kubernetes really understands containers. It doesn't really understand other sort of computing artifacts, at least not nearly as well. It kind of understands VMs. So it'll be interesting to see if we see this technology that's sort of living in the CNCF now. If it gets any popularity, does that fragment the Kubernetes thing? Because it, sort of take us back to the whole, like, should you do containers or should you do serverless? Well, does WebAssembly or WASM sort of refragment that argument that we used to have, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 years ago?
Yep. And I'll add this real quick, just because you happen to mention serverless and it popped into my head. I saw little to no serverless.
Yeah, some serverless, like, hey, we're serverless database or whatever. But yeah, serverless conf has kind of gone away because obviously A Cloud Guru got acquired. But yeah, that whole thing, I think it's out there. I just don't think it's not what it was. And the CNCF has never really figured out serverless. Like Knative is kind of a thing, but not really a thing. So yeah, it kind of makes sense. It works best when it's just a cloud hosted service as Lambda or whatever.
Yeah. So I'll ask you this, like, what's your take on everything? Are we in a bubble of sorts? There's lots of companies out there. There's certainly lots of categories out there. Just like anything else, I see it as there's lots of categories, but there's lots of folks in each of those categories. So as something we've talked about on the show many different times, you can't support that many. You'll see a consolidation down to 2 to 3 to maybe 5 in each category. What do you think happens over time?
I think there's a little bit of yes in that in terms of bubbleness. I think the thing that you and I talked about, the 2 or 3 things that jump out at me is the things we talked about that we need to keep an eye on. One of them is you mentioned, like, it's fine if there are 300 vendors. It could be fine if there were 500 vendors. Like the number isn't really what's relevant. It was, you look at any category, cost management or service mesh or whatever it might be, and there's 10 vendors in that space. And just historically, that never happened. Like that doesn't survive, right? So first and foremost, obviously a lot of VC money over the last few years, lots of companies got started. There's a good chance that, some percentage of those, maybe it's half of them, maybe it's a third of them, who knows, probably don't survive through just the natural attrition of our market. Our market tends to support 2 to 3, legitimate companies in any given market sector, right? And that's historically in good times and bad times. I think the more interesting thing is going to be, and somebody, I can't remember if it was you or somebody was like, it would be really interesting to figure out how much money just basically flows directly from VCs to the CNCF, right? Whether it's, through KubeCon or whether it's through sponsorship of the CNCF or through, funding the way that CNCF puts up infrastructure so that the open source projects can do all this sort of testing, hence why there are so many projects in that. And to me, that's almost equally as interesting because, again, the VCs are only going to support the things that have a return. And if the economy gets a little bit tight and they pull back some money or, some of these companies don't make it, what does the CNCF hence look like a year from now, 2 years from now? Like, can they still support 115 projects in their keynote, or do they come back next year and go, hey, well, there's only 65 because there's only so many maintainers and there's only so many whatever. So I feel like that's the bubble maybe that we're in. Like it feels overinflated. I don't know if it's a bubble like it bursts, but it does feel overinflated.
Yeah. And I'll add this too, to the CNCF's credit, they're very upfront of their mission is to provide a platform and an ecosystem and an environment to incubate projects. They don't have a horse in the race, and they are, for all intents and purposes, an arms dealer, right? They're going to serve anyone that wants to be served, and they don't necessarily pick favorites or pick sides in any of this. And they have flat out said, yes, everything will eventually consolidate down, and that's not our job.
Right. Yeah. They sort of said, hey, it's not, we just facilitate stuff, which I think is fair. I mean, they've always been sort of neutral arbitrators of all this stuff. Let's sort of wrap this up because obviously, there's a lot of stuff. We put a link in the show notes to kind of all the announcements that came out that week from all the vendors and CNCF, so you can dig into those things too. But I guess sort of last question, like, what do you see as next for KubeCon? The next couple of events 2 years from now, what do you see evolving?
Well, so here's the number one thing. I think this trend of what you're talking about, I do think it's going to continue to get bigger, but I also don't think it can survive as one big event going forward. I think it has a couple shows left like that. And then I think it will naturally splinter into, maybe it becomes a KubeCon and then a service mesh con and a WASM or WebAssembly con, or, I think it's going to break into one or two big things that will necessarily break off. And then it's going to be like a CloudNativeCon for the smaller ones that can't justify their own. Yeah. So I think it's going to be a combination of both. There's going to be some big events, but I also think there's going to be some little events.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And I think even that'll go through some stuff because, if you're a vendor, it's expensive to do multiple events. It's hard to keep up with them, the timing of them and everything. So yeah, I think that's right. I think if they don't sort of find a centering technology, which the odds are they probably don't, unless something reinvigorates Kubernetes and it goes through a bunch of new changes or something. I think that's probably right. I do think it'll be, if I think back to like the early days of KubeCon, there was always a sense of like, hey, this is where really interesting stuff's happening, even if it was just Kubernetes and say like the first service mesh or Prometheus or whatever it was. But at the same time, you sort of went, boy, this is the center of like open source innovation. And look at how big reInvent is, in comparison. You were like, oh, it's just so much. And so I think, if we say like, this event was 7,000, or let's call it 10,000 or whatever, and reInvent this year is, let's say, 80,000 people. And if KubeCon can potentially fragment itself, like, then you're sort of like, oh, okay. Like KubeCon always was successful because like it could convey the idea that there's momentum going on in open source, and all these communities are sort of linked together. I think they got to be really careful that they don't let it fragment too much. I think there's value in it having some weight of all the things being in one place. I think they just may have to rethink kind of how they organize it and focus it and stuff like that.
Yeah, agreed.
Go
ahead.
Do you think, because you've been to some, I've probably been to more of them, do you think the CNCF has become too much of a marketing event? Like, do you get the sense that people are like, there's no more technical value there?
I have mixed feelings about this. And what I mean by that is I do think from a sponsor or a vendor side, I mean, the CNCF, they'll take your money.
Sure.
They know how to make money off these events, or I shouldn't say make money. They know how to produce a big event, based off of sponsorships and everything else that's going on. Now, I do think, I think the bigger it gets, the more like the day one, day two kind of things, or the folks that want to find the really, really technical stuff, or maybe that's like they get together once or twice a year with, smaller teams that normally are virtual. I think that is where it really continues and how it stays as a technical event and an audience that has, attracts technical folks to it. I do worry, again, I keep relaying it back to OpenStack conferences. I do worry, it's like the hoodies to jackets ratio.
Yeah.
And I don't think we're necessarily anywhere close to something like that yet. But the bigger it gets, and especially like, okay, the bigger the booths are and the more the sponsors, well, then they got to bring their execs to have customer meetings, and then they got to go do customer dinners. Like, we know how this system works.
Yeah.
And I don't want it to turn into that. Yeah.
I think the feedback I got and saw from talking to various people is like, I think the technical sessions are still perceived to be very good, and they're very in-depth. I think the only challenge they have is that the more projects that you're kind of conveying, you have a finite number of rooms, a finite number of slots. It becomes harder and harder if you're there and you're like, man, I am really a hardcore whatever service mesh person, whatever it is, security person. Like, the odds of you being able to be like, I can find like stuff to do for 2 straight days of good technical stuff gets harder. This is why you're seeing the Monday and Tuesday things. I think they have to figure out some sort of way to go, like, for that techie audience that wants to come to this thing, that, is willing to pay for it, their boss is willing to pay for it, that you don't diversify it so much that they're like, I can't get enough goodness out of it. Right. I don't think they've sacrificed on the technical quality. I think they've diluted the ability for somebody who goes, I really need to learn something more in depth to go to this thing, which they used to be able to do when there was obviously less projects and, there was more there to kind of pull from. So I think they're going to have to find out some balance between the 2 or 3 days that are quote unquote KubeCon and the pre-days when you have this sort of in-depth stuff. And maybe it's just as simple as like a more blended ticket, or I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
But something along those lines, I think is there. So
yeah, that's good. That's a good place to wrap up. I like that.
Yeah, let's wrap up there. Overall, look, I'm from Detroit, so I'm not going to sort of badmouth that. I got to see family and eat some good pizza and all that sort of stuff. I think more than anything, it was good to be back with everybody. It was good to be back live with people. The masks got a little annoying, but obviously health is important. I think it's still a good show. It's a B+. Obviously there's areas to improve, but more than anything, it's sort of nice to be back at shows, just live and being around and seeing people.
Agreed. In the grading system, I will give it also I'd say A- B+. We're right in that.
Somewhere like that. Absolutely. So cool. All right, man. Well, let's a good wrap up. We haven't really talked about trade shows in a long time. I think now that they're back live, it's good to talk about them. And hey, the other thing, thank you to everybody. We just had our first 200,000 listen month ever, the biggest month we've ever had. And sometimes I'm not even sure, why that's happened, but we've been having bigger and bigger months over the last 6 months. So thank you to everybody who is listening, obviously telling a friend, maybe telling two friends. It's awesome to be able to speak to so many of you. And we went over what we did, the number of listens that we had in 2021, we just exceeded in all of 2022 with 2 months left. So thank you all. Can't thank you all enough for continuing to listen. I know there's lots of options for you, and we're glad that we provide something that's valuable to you. So Aaron, you want to wrap it up? Take us home?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you enjoy this, please leave us a review, in addition to telling a friend. But we would love to, wherever you get your podcasts, if you have that ability, go ahead and leave us a review. Also, if you have any feedback, reach out to us on Twitter or email. Email is listed in the bottom of the show notes. And so with that, I'm going to wrap it up for this week. On behalf of Brian and myself, thanks everyone for listening, and we will talk to everyone next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.